Introduction to the Gospel according to St. Mark. The Synoptic Gospels. The first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are always known as the Synoptic Gospels. The word synoptic comes from two Greek words which mean to see together, and these three are called the Synoptic Gospels because they can be set down in parallel columns and their common matter looked at together. They contain the same incidents often told in the same words, and they contain accounts of the teaching of Jesus which are often almost identical. If we compare the story of the feeding of the 5,000 in the three Gospels, Mark 6:30-44, Matthew 14:12-21, Luke 9:10-17, we see that it is told in almost exactly the same words and in exactly the same way. A very clear instance of this is the story of the healing of the man who was sick of the palsy, Mark 2:1-12, Matthew 9:1-8, Luke 5:17-26. Mark, the writer of the Gospel. A close examination of the three Gospels makes it clear that Matthew and Luke had Mark before them as they wrote, and they used his Gospel as the basis into which they fitted the extra material which they wished to include. Mark was the son of a well-to-do lady of Jerusalem whose name was Mary, and whose house was a rallying point and meeting place of the early church, Acts 12:12. From the very beginning Mark was brought up in the very center of the Christian fellowship. Mark was also the nephew of Barnabas, and when Paul and Barnabas set out on their first missionary journey they took Mark with them to be their secretary and attendant, Act 12:25. This journey was a most unfortunate one for Mark. When they reached Perga, Paul proposed to strike inland up to the central plateau, and for some reason Mark left the expedition and went home, Acts 13:13. Paul and Barnabas completed their first missionary journey and then proposed to set out upon their second. Barnabas was anxious to take Mark with them again. But Paul refused to have anything to do with the man who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia. Acts 15:37-40. So serious was the difference between them that Paul and Barnabas split company, and, so far as we know, never worked together again. For some years Mark vanishes from history. Tradition has it that he went down to Egypt and founded the Church of Alexandria there. Whether or not that is true we do not know, but we do know that when Mark re-emerges it is in the most surprising way. We learn to our surprise that when Paul writes the letter to the Colossians from prison in Rome, Mark is there with him, Colossians 4:10. In another prison letter, to Philemon, Paul numbers Mark among his fellow laborers. And, when Paul is waiting for death and very near the end, he writes to Timothy, his right-hand man, and says, "Take Mark and bring him with you, for he is a most useful servant to me." 2 Timothy 4:11. It is a far cry from the time when Paul contemptuously dismissed Mark as a quitter. Whatever had happened, Mark had redeemed himself. He was the one man Paul wanted at the end. Mark's sources of information. At the end of the 2nd century there was a man called Papias who liked to obtain and transmit such information as he could glean about the early days of the church. He tells us that Mark's Gospel is nothing other than a record of the preaching material of Peter, the greatest of the apostles. Certainly Mark stood so close to Peter, and so near to his heart, that Peter could call him Mark, my son. 1 Peter 5:13. Here is what Papias says. Mark, who was Peter's interpreter, wrote down accurately, though not in order, all that he recollected of what Christ had said or done. For he was not a hearer of the Lord or a follower of his. He followed Peter, as I have said, at a later date, and Peter adapted his instruction to practical needs, without any attempt to give the Lord's words systematically. We may then take it that in his Gospel we have what Mark remembered of the preaching material of Peter himself. Lost ending. Then, we have two great reasons why Mark is a book of supreme importance. First, it is the earliest of all the Gospels. If it was written just shortly after Peter died its date will be about AD 65. Second, it embodies the record of what Peter preached and taught about Jesus. There is a very interesting thing about Mark's Gospel. In its original form it stops at Mark 16:8. We know that for two reasons. First, the verses which follow, Mark 16:9-20, are not in any of the great early manuscripts, only later and inferior manuscripts contain them. Second, the style of the Greek is so different that they cannot have been written by the same person as wrote the rest of the Gospel. Characteristics of Mark's Gospel. Aim was to give a picture of Jesus as he was. Westcott called it a transcript from life. A.B. Bruce said that it was written from the viewpoint of loving, vivid recollection, and that its great characteristic was realism. If ever we are to get anything approaching a biography of Jesus, it must be based on Mark, for it is his delight to tell the facts of Jesus' life in the simplest and most dramatic way. The awe and astonishment which he evoked are always before Mark's mind. They were astonished at his teaching. Mark 1:22. They were all amazed. Mark 1:27. Such phrases occur again and again. Not only was this astonishment in the minds of the crowds who listened to Jesus, it was still more in the minds of the inner circle of the disciples. And they were filled with awe, and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even wind and sea obey him?" Mark 4:41. And they were utterly astounded. Mark 6:51. The disciples were amazed at his words. Mark 10:24-26. As a human picture of Jesus. Sometimes its picture is so human that the later writers alter it a little because they are almost afraid to say what Mark said. To Mark, Jesus is simply the carpenter. Mark 6:3. Later Matthew alters that to the carpenter's son, Matthew 13:55. When Mark is telling of the temptations of Jesus, he writes, "The Spirit drove him into the wilderness." Mark 1:12. Matthew and Luke do not like this word drove used of Jesus, so they soften it down and say, Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness. Matthew 4:1, Luke 4:1. No one tells us so much about the emotions of Jesus as Mark does. Jesus sighed deeply in his spirit, Mark 7:34, Mark 8:12. He was moved with compassion, Mark 6:34. He marveled at their unbelief, Mark 6:6. He was moved with righteous anger, Mark 3:5, Mark 8:33, Mark 10:14. Only Mark tells us that when Jesus looked at the rich young ruler he loved him, Mark 10:21. Jesus could feel the pangs of hunger, Mark 11:12. He could be tired and want to rest, Mark 6:31. Mark's Gospel, the sheer humanity of Jesus in Mark's picture brings him very near to us. When Mark is telling the story of the stilling of the storm, he has one little sentence that none of the other Gospel writers have. And he was in the hinder part of the ship asleep on a pillow, Mark 4:38. And that one touch makes the picture vivid before our eyes. Generally speaking, we do not keep the historic presents in translation, because in English they do not sound well, but they show how vivid and real the thing was to Mark's mind, as if it was happening before his very eyes. He quite often gives us the very Aramaic words which Jesus used. To Jairus' daughter, Jesus said, Talitha cumi. Mark 5:41. To the deaf man with the impediment in his speech he said, Ephphatha. Mark 7:34. The dedicated gift is korban. Mark 7:11. In the garden he says, Abba Father. Mark 14:36. On the cross he cries, Eloi Eloi lama sabachthani. Mark 15:30.